Hello and welcome to CounterPunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitser. Thanks so much for tuning in, coming back to the show. First-time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. Always happy to have you. Hey, if you're watching the video, you are a CounterPunch Plus subscriber, and we are ever so grateful for that support. If you're listening to the free podcast, well, now is the time to consider getting that CounterPunch Plus subscription. There's so much extra content there. You go to CounterPunch every single day. You see tons of articles, but there's so much more that you're missing in CounterPunch Plus. So get yourself a subscription, support CounterPunch that way. This media project has been going for nearly 30 years, and we plan to have many more years in the future. We recently had a fund drive. Thank you again to everybody who supported us and supported this work and really supports grassroots media. We need that on the left as these spaces are shrinking seemingly every day. And of course, one of the great perks of doing this show is that I get to chat with a lot of interesting people, and I have another interesting journalist to chat with today, somebody whose work is incredibly important. So let me just introduce her right now. Jacqueline Keeler is with us. Jacqueline is a journalist. She is an author of a very important book, actually a couple of important books that she was involved in. The first I would nod to is Standoff, Standing Rock, the Bundy Movement, and the American Story of Sacred Lands. Absolutely critical read. I would highly recommend you get that. We're recording before Christmas, so if you're listening to this, get that Christmas gift, and preferably from an independent bookseller if you can. Also, I would recommend her other book that she edited, Edge of Morning, Native Voices Speak for the Bear's Ears. Again, critical collection. Please do consider getting a copy of that one as well. Jacqueline Keeler, welcome to CounterPunch.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for all of your great work and for giving me some time tonight, because there's so much important information that we need to cover. So let's just jump right into it. I want to begin by giving you a chance to introduce yourself to our audience, some of whom I'm sure already know your work, but many of whom probably don't. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, what brought you to the work that you're doing, and how did you get into all of this?
Yeah, well, I'm a journalist primarily, and also an author, and I guess I'd always had an interest in telling Native stories, Native perspectives. I am myself a citizen of the Navajo Nation. My mother is Navajo, and my father is Yankton Sioux, Dakota, and so I both sides of my family are both Native, and just trying to make sense of our situation has always been my focus, and then so that's why I write, is to help do that. I think we have few resources as Indigenous people to come to terms with our history. Our stories are not told generally or understood. I mean, I can't tell you how many people tell me that I'm the first Native person they've ever met, or say things like they didn't know we were still around. All these things, and so it's sort of it makes it it's sort of shocking actually to be told that, but it makes it really clear that I think that for a lot of white people, they don't understand that experience of being completely like invisible. I often, when I talked about the mascot issue, people would kind of try to explain what it meant to have just these sort of stereotypical representations, and people would say, well, what about the Vikings? Like the whataboutism sort of thing. And the really difference between the Viking stereotypes, and that's promoted by mascotry of Indigenous people, is that that's not the only way that white men are seen, right? If that was the case, if you never saw a white man, ever, except as a Viking, right? You never saw them in a Hollywood movie saving the world. You never saw them anchoring the evening news. You never saw them ever. You go into a bookstore like Powell's bookstore here in Portland, where I live, and out of all the thousands of books they have there, maybe 3 are from the perspective of a white man. and how many of those are from a white man like you? I mean, this is our actual situation, our actual lived experiences. I mean, how many novels are written from the perspective of a Native woman like myself? With the protagonist being a Native woman who is college educated and from it just doesn't exist, I would say. And so it's the level of marginalization of Native people is extreme, and to be a Native person who lives in such a situation requires, I don't know, I felt like it really requires for us to do the work, and the work I do is for for all Native people. So
It sounds like you're talking about something more than just representation, right?
yeah, yeah, I think you know, so with eradicating offensive Native mascotry, I got involved with that in 2013. Myself and several other Native parents, and we really focused on the Washington pro football team, and other teams as well. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. My parents met there through a program called Relocation, which was an initiative by Congress in the mid 20th century to basically terminate tribes politically, and then to relocate the young people to urban centers like Cleveland was a relocation center. So my parents, as young people, this went on from the late 50s to the early 70s, and they young people between the ages of 18 and 30 on the reservation could go on these programs. And so my parents met in Cleveland. At the time, there were, I don't know, about 20,000 young Native people there. It was probably the most Native people in Cleveland since Tecumseh lost, and so that's where they met, and so I'm a product of these sorts of policies to basically finish us off politically, and so when I worked on the mascot issue, I was part of the team that created and trended the hashtag Not Your Mascot. That was actually created by Eradicating Offensive Native Mascotry. And mascotry is a term that I kind of came up with because I think that sometimes when we say mascot, people would think of these very prosaic images of brave warriors and stuff. How could you be mad about that? But really, we're talking about mascotry, which is what they do with it, right? All the red face and all the ridiculous things they do. And so mascotry to me was sort of a term that was, I don't know, akin to like minstrelsy, like sort of this active thing they're doing with it. And so, but yeah, once we were working on that as a group, I started to realize that I started wondering, why is it our identity is so assumable, right? Why can people just take it? And of course, I think Suzanne Harjo had a great essay where she described it as akin to sort of scalps, or like, these are sort of trophies of war, right? These are the victors who get to take what they want, right? And the more I thought about it, the more I felt, and why does it happen to Native people? Like, why are people, the whole issue of red face, people even in their real lives trying to pretend to be us for jobs and clout. But I suddenly realized that it really had to do with the power structure of colonialism and occupation, which basically, in order for the United States to exist, it has to deny our existence, and also particularly our political existence as nations, as citizens of nations. So this sort of political cloudiness, this fuzziness around the edges of our identity, is purposeful. It's the result of hundreds of years of U.S. policy, and before that, colonial policy. So I think that, for me, this is sort of the crucial aspect, is how do we then make our political outlines far more real, right? Because with our political outlines comes our rights to the land, to our rights as these treaties we entered into, our respective nations did, and not to say these treaties were fair, but they are the actual act of treatying with us, like as we saw at Standing Rock with the Fort Laramie treaties, which were ratified by the U.S. Senate and with the Great Sioux Nation. So the Senate does not ratify treaties with anyone but sovereign nations. Under international law, treaties are only entered into with sovereign nations. And also under international law, treaties are an act of sovereignty. They cannot be utilized to extinguish sovereignty. So often Americans think that we signed these treaties and we disappeared, right? This is the idea. It is actually not the legal actual reality. And so treaties are a way in which tribes are utilizing today to basically to affirm their continued existence and to deny our erasure as political entities and nations in the world. And so I give this lecture, and the book Standoff sort of grew out of this lecture, which is that the title that America is still a colony. It calls itself a country, but it's really an ongoing occupation, right? As is Canada. And so these are other people's homelands, right? That are being occupied. And so I really I saw Standing Rock as a moment in which the militarized response, right, and to realize that pipeline north of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation was actually still an unceded treaty land. That whole Morton County area is occupied and held by the U.S. in violation of international law, ongoing violations that have been going on since the 1860s. So and it is a military occupation, and what Standing Rock did is it made that military occupation visible.
Indeed, I think that's a really great point to make because it is militarized, and I do want to talk about that in a second. But well, actually, you know what? Let me just talk about that right now since we brought it up. So let's talk a little bit about pipelines because this issue is so central to a lot of activism that has been done both by indigenous groups and also by those who position themselves as allies of indigenous people and of the tribes. So, can you talk a little bit about this struggle without getting into all of the specifics about each and every front in this broader struggle? Let's talk about it at sort of the macro level. How did this fight emerge and why is it important to understand at a, let's call it at a structural level? Why do we need to think of it in that way?
Yeah. Um, so when before I started reporting on Standing Rock in 2016, in 2014 and 2013, I reported on the Keystone XL pipeline. And when I was out in the field, I talked to a lot of South Dakota ranchers and farmers, and North Dakota and Nebraska ranchers and farmers, landowners, and some of them were Republicans, but they were on the side. They were working in concert with the tribes to fight this pipeline. And it was interesting talking to these white farmers and ranchers, and they were well, it was actually a rancher I was talking to, and he was completely stunned. He was like, he's a Republican, and he just could not believe that the U.S. government had given the rights of eminent domain, governmental rights, to a Canadian company, TransCanada, right? And I remember looking at him and I was thinking, don't you know the history of this country? And because I immediately thought of the fact that the colonies were originally, many of them, joint stock companies, the earliest ones, right? And those are early corporations, early modern era corporations. And basically, the crown, I guess Queen Elizabeth I, right? She could not afford to fund exploration and colonization out of her own funds, so she turned to her subjects and allowed them to create these joint stock companies so that they could share the risk and the profits. And in exchange, she gave them basically governmental powers over our lands that they held. So you look at the colony of Virginia, which was founded by the Virginia Company of Adventurers based in London, and it was a for-profit enterprise. And they were given, of course, of course, people make a big deal about the fact that when I went to Virginia when I was writing this book, I was invited to speak at the College of William and Mary, and all over Virginia, you'll see signs like "Virginia's for lovers," "Virginia's the birthplace of democracy," all this stuff. And I remember thinking, well, Virginia, it's a corporate. It was originally a corporate entity, the House of but it was their legislature, and so was the Mayflower Compact. The people who signed it were all stockholders. You know, so so I really think that the corporate nature of this colonial occupation is intrinsic to it, right? And I also can contrast that to this notion of land ownership, right? And of course, a landowner in South Dakota or the Bundys on their ideas of land ownership in Nevada, and also expressed here in Oregon when they occupied the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. I examined that pretty carefully in the book. I actually I decided to engage their claims, which of course have never held up in a court of law. Their claims of the right to use the commons, and I began to look at some of the origins of the language they were using, particularly from the Revolutionary War and also from the English Civil War. And I got a clue to this, not just based on the fact that there were guys dressed up in Revolutionary War outfits at Malheur, but also because there was a sign in Clive and Bundy. Clive and Bundy was the father He is a rancher in Bunkerville, Nevada. In 2014, he had a standoff with the Bureau of Land Management over his cattle grazing on public lands, about 500,000 acres, which he had not paid for like 20 years, right? And I wrote about this for The Nation in 2014, and I did a comparison between Cliven's claims of ancestral rights to that of, well, what was going on with the Keystone XL pipeline at the time and the work of the unified group of the Cowboys and Indians group in South Dakota and Nebraska to fight the Keystone XL pipelines. And but he had a sign on the wall of his house, and it said, "Remember what the name Bundy means." Right. And I was like, what does the name Bundy mean? It's such a strange surname. And I looked it up, and the primary meaning is, and I checked. I think he was trying to go with more of a French meaning, but I looked at his family tree, and they are from actually the area around Stonehenge. They go way back. They're Anglo-Saxon. And so but the name Bundy actually comes from the name Bond, which James Bond, which means bondsman or bondswoman, right? And what they would do is under feudalism, under Anglo-Saxon feudalism, they would give their bond to a lord, right? And this lord would then give them land to farm. And you have to understand, under feudalism, the only person who owns land is the monarch, and everyone else, the subjects, they only can use it because the monarch gives them the right? And so the people are essentially landless, right, under this system. And so, but what happened after William the Conqueror and the Normans invaded in 1066 is that Anglo-Saxon tradition became sort of de facto serfdom. The Bundys, when the Lord inherited the land, he inherited the Bundys. So their relationship to the land is very different than that of Indigenous people, right? And I give a definition of a colonist, and then I also give a definition of an Indigenous people. And and we kind of know what colonists are. They go to other people's homelands, they occupy them, and they export the wealth to their ruling class. That's the colonist, right? And but what is an Indigenous person? And so I had to kind of find a similar, kind of really simplistic definition. And what I came upon was written by my grandmother's cousin, Vine Deloria Jr., and he was a member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. He was a well-known historian and writer and professor, and he wrote the book Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto in 1969, and was sort of the Bible of our sort of Red Power movement in the 70s. And he has a definition of Indigenous people, which is that a people, with a capital P, because Indigenous people, we often call ourselves the people. Like my mother is, and the Navajos call themselves Diné, which means the real people. And a people have an origin story based in a meeting with a sacred being who is a manifestation of the land itself, right? And in this meeting, we are given sort of original instructions. We have, we don't come to land with these concepts of dominion, of sort of ownership, but we come as relatives, kinship, responsibility. So we are given, responsibilities. We are given rights in this relationship. As relatives with the land and with all the people who are already on the land. And this includes, the animals and the plants. And so with my father's people, for them, it was really the meeting with the white buffalo calf woman. When she came, she was a manifestation of the Great Plains itself, right? And these are specific areas. It's not the entire planet. It's a specific area. So we share the outcomes of that place. Right. And so when she came to us, she brought the pipe, the champa, right? And the pipe had, the stem was not made of wood. It was made of the front calf leg bone of a buffalo, right? And so when we smoked that, we made an agreement with her and also with the Buffalo Nation, the Tatanka Oyatewa. And so this is the basis of our relationship to the land. And also that's when we became Lakota. And so my Lala used to say, and he grew up in Wakpala in Standing Rock, my grandma's cousin, and he used to say, we did not become, Lakota until we met the white buffalo calf woman. Once we met her, then we became Lakota. Before that, we were something else entirely. Right. So there's this notion of the land makes you a people, makes you who you are. And it's that relationship. Right. And it's a very different relationship than a feudal one, where only one man, your relationship to land is mediated by a human being. right? And you yourself, and to this day, and there was a book that came out a couple of years ago, and they looked at sort of the land ownership in England today, and there was also in Scotland. And what they found was that 30% of the land in England is still owned outright by the descendants of William the Conqueror and his friends. And they estimate another 40% is probably owned by companies that they control, right? So, I mean, 70% of the land in England is still owned almost 1,000 years later by this guy and his friends who invaded, right? And so the British people, the English people, are still landless, as they were when they came here. And so when you look at these folks, landowners in South Dakota or Nevada or Oregon making these claims that this gives them rights, they have to realize that those rights are fairly new for them, and they are the spoils of colonialism, right? Agreements made through colonialism. And so I think what I try to do is examine things and then to change the parameters and maybe provide a more accurate analysis that helps us come to conclusions and solutions.
Well, and to your point, the point you were just making about the relationship to the land, I mean, that's, the idea of a water protector is not some branding exercise. It has both a political context, but also a spiritual and historical context as well. It's not just a sort of a role that you're play acting as for the purposes of activism, right? It has a very deep spiritual connotation, as does, fire and other things like that. I know just in my very, very, very cursory exposure to these things, water protectors, women, motherhood, maternity. I mean, these things are all kind of connected, aren't they?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think, but I think it's also equally important that European-based societies like English colonists reassess who and what they are, because what they tell themselves is not accurate, and then it makes it impossible to create change, right? Another example of this would be the interpretation of the Revolutionary War, right? The Because I addressed this because the Bundys kept bringing up these sorts of things like from the Revolutionary War, like no taxation without representation. They carried all those little pocket constitutions in their front pocket and everything, and those Skoosin constitutions, and it's so I looked at that very closely, and what I found was interesting. Uh, so George Washington, was a very young man in the French and Indian War. He actually and historians believe that he actually started the war, and historians call the French and Indian War the World War Zero. It was the first World War, and it was actually started over the lust for land of Indian land by the colonists, right? George Washington was he was like 20 years old. He was very young, and he was sent by Virginia, the House of Burgesses, to lead a militia group to challenge the French. At the time, a lot of the colonies, like Connecticut and Virginia, they claimed, according to their charters with the crown, they claimed the land all the way to the Pacific Ocean, right? So they viewed the Ohio Valley, Virginia did, as part of their claim, right? And so the French were building forts along the Ohio River to sort of firm up their own claim. And so when George Washington came in, this very young man, with his militia and with his Indian allies, came in, he created an international situation. According to him, one of his Indian allies murdered French diplomat. According to the French, who made him sign a letter in French, George Washington took responsibility for killing this French diplomat, and this was an international, scandal. And so it basically started the French Indian War, what we call it here, but in Europe, which they call the 7 Years' War, right? And this war was fought, because the colonists were wanting to get more and more Indian land. It doubled the national debt of both Britain and France. And after the war was settled, to stop this from happening again, the British agreed, and King George III issued the Proclamation Line of 1763, which went along the Appalachian Mountains, and said that the colonists could not go past that line. And when you read the Declaration of Independence, most of the bullet items in there have to do with this this decision, right? King George III has set upon his evil, merciless Indian savages. This is all about the Proclamation Line of 1763, right? Which then closed most of New York State and all these places that we think of as part of the colonies were not actually part of the colonies. This was Indian land. Most New York State was pretty much the Iroquois Confederacy, which had stood for 1,000 years, right? This is my husband's people. And my husband is actually a direct descendant of Chief Joseph Brown, who led the fight against the Americans trying to invade their lands. But anyway, so this settlement quite angered the colonists, and they had basically taxed their homeland to because of their interest in more their lust for Indian land, right? Had taxed their homeland. Their homeland was, people in England were having to pay taxes to pay for this war. The colonial governments refused to levy taxes on their populace, and so that's why King George III was doing the Stamp Act, doing these other ways of trying to tax them to pay for the war they started, right? And the whole thing of quartering soldiers was to prevent them to keep them out of Indian land. And so there's this whole notion, this whole aspect to which our understanding of the Revolutionary War is largely propaganda, right? And it really sort of excludes the real issue of the taking of Indian land and the cost of that, which they were then just sending it back home to their homeland, right? And so this is this is sort of, so I think it really provides a different and I see the Revolutionary War as actually a fight between elites on either side of the Atlantic, and the colonial elites here, and George Washington was all these founding fathers were members of land companies, right? George Washington was invested in the Ohio Land Company. One of the what's his name, Morristown. He was one of the wealthiest men in the colony. I mean, if you read the bios of all these founding fathers, they're all the wealthiest men of their era. And he got like a third of the Iroquois Confederacy in the end. He got to take a third of upstate New York. They got their land. They got all the things they wanted, and they got it, fairly cheaply. And so I think it's I think understanding. I think we need to, create. So if we understand the Revolutionary War this way, it really changes what we think we can do about it, or what rights it gives Americans, particularly Americans like the Bundys.
Such an important point. And before we go to the break, I want to just touch on one other issue that is tangentially, well, it's related to everything we're talking about, but it is related to what you were saying, the taking of land, and understanding it in that way, the taking of land. There is a really painful and awful parallel, and that is the taking of human beings, the taking of children, the disappearance of generations of Indigenous children. And this is, of course, in the headlines today because of the unearthing of remains, and I think at least several sites in the last couple of months, and probably more to come. Can you talk a little bit about the mass graves, the discovery of these mass graves, and more importantly, I mean, that's shocking in and of itself, but what it tells us about the legacy, and specifically about genocide and what genocide looks like, because it's not just 6 million Jews being marched into a gas chamber. It's something that takes place over a long period of time, and often sort of not entirely in plain sight. So tell us a little bit about this issue, and also sort of this context of understanding it in the way that you were just describing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm actually working on an assignment from a Canadian magazine, and it's actually looking at the issue of these mass graves that are being found in residential schools in Canada, right? There's been, I think, almost well over 1,000 graves found, and I think almost 1,500. And I'm focusing on the Mohawk Institute in Canada, in Ontario, which actually members of my husband's family went there. And it's his reserve, the Six Nations Reserve in Canada, which is leading sort of, they control the institute now, the buildings, and they're trying to they're leading the search for more bodies, and also they're actually also rehabilitating this. They're turning it into a sort of a place where a memorial to them, and also a community center, and it's been I mean, I just spent an hour today going through the whole story with my editor, and it's very heavy, and listening to all the testimony. And for my husband, it was quite emotional because he made him understand more where his grandparents were coming from, the trauma they went through as small children. And it's just disgusting to hear the stories. I mean, these folks were I mean, this is, the Iroquois. My husband is a descendant of Chief Joseph Brant, and they were sort of called derisively Brant Mohawks, right? And they he was the Revolutionary War split the Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy, as I mentioned before, stood for 1,000 years. It originally consisted of 5 nations, and then Tuscarora joined them once their homeland was taken over, and they came and so these 6 nations were, in upstate New York, and they were split. Some of them joined the Americans, and then the group led by my husband's ancestor, they fought against the Americans to protect their homeland, and they lost, right? And they lived in what was called the Mohawk Valley, right? They had these castles there and everything. And so when the British negotiated the treaty, they sold them out. They didn't consult them. They went and just let the Americans have their land. And so when Chief Joseph Brant, when he complained, he was then given what they call the Haldeman Tract in Ontario, right? Which is like, it goes along on the other side, I think about so many kilometers on the other side of the Grand River in Ontario. Basically, it's like a half circle around Toronto, semicircle of land. But they've lost most of it. Now they just have a small little section left, which is the 6 Nations Reserve on the Grand River. And but after all this happened to them, and they had to, lost their homeland in New York State, and they had to go here. And then this Mohawk Institute was established, I think, around 1830, I think. And then, there the children were taken, and they were forcibly Christianized. They were not allowed to speak their language. They were starved. I mean, a lot of the survivors today, who are very elderly people in their 70s and 80s, they talk about not having enough food to eat. They called it the mush, I think, the mush hole, because there was just mush to eat. And I think about, when I visited my husband's reserve, it's this gorgeous sort of New England looking place. Yet the minute you cross the boundary, it's just tract housing all the way, from there on. And but it's my in-laws talk about how, they were farmers, they had lots of food to eat, but when they send their children to this school, their children are living in starvation situations. Do you know what I mean? And it's just horrific to think that, these are very small children, like 6 years old, right? And being unloved, being treated, they were talking about having to hold out their hands and having them smacked, right, like that. And just ways in which, most Indian people don't practice physical, traditionally speaking. Of course, after the boarding school and residential school experiences, it's different now. But traditionally, they didn't use physical abuse. It was unknown, right? And it was thought that through example, you could train children. And my great aunt, Ella Deloria, she was an ethnologist and linguist. She studied under Franz Boas at Columbia University, and she spent her life documenting these traditions in our own Lakota and Dakota cultures. And they had just a different system of raising children, and it was a very effective system too. And it was destroyed by these schools, and our children came out broken. They were also raped, molested, and so the people we are today, if you go to Seattle now and you see Indian people on the streets, it's because of this system that broke them, and then it becomes intergenerational, the trauma, they take it home with them, right? And so it's, and I feel like my family, my dad's family and my mother's family, that the reason we were lucky, we were never in these Catholic run schools, although the Mohawk Institute was Anglican, it wasn't Catholic. But most of the schools, particularly in Canada, like 3/4 of them were run by the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church is now refusing to turn over any sort of documentation they have about what happened there. A lot of it was shredded for some bizarre reason, to recycle paper. I don't know, it's bizarre. And the Pope Pope Francis has agreed to give an audience to some of the survivors. They had to postpone that because of the Omicron variant, but I don't think that's going to lead to any opening of records. And the Canadian government has just recently agreed to give $40 billion Canadian, I think about 30 billion American dollars, to sort of to give restitution to survivors, and also to begin to hand over the social welfare programs for for First Nations children to their respective bands and nations. And so that whole process, but yeah, the focus of my article is going to be on how the Six Nations people are basically taking control of this narrative, are also taking a lead in the criminal investigation, um, and um, and sort of their ownership of it, and of this really painful history. And when I married my husband, I met his grandmother. His grandfather already was deceased. His grandfather was the Mohawk Bear Clan chief at Six Nations, and his grandmother, her father was the Pine Tree chief of the Seneca Nation there. The Six Nations includes the Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Oneida, and then Tuscarora was the sixth. And also some Delaware, Lenape as well joined them. But yeah, it's I could see what he means by that. You could see, that they're carrying pain, and you don't know why. And but when you see what happened to them, you understand what happened to them as children, then suddenly it makes sense. You know what happened, even if they are high functioning adults. You know what happened, and that sort of trauma and damage. That's, the occupation of our lands takes many forms, and the arrogance takes many forms, and so it's that's what they did. Obviously, sexual abuse also occurs in very expensive, prominent elite boarding schools as well. you know, but it was even more traumatic when it's laced with implicit inferiority of a people. And the Six Nations, the Iroquois people, they were the most powerful people there on in the Eastern Seaboard. They were the nation that really held the colonists at bay. Kept that line there along the Appalachian Mountains. Up into the Revolutionary War, and playing the English against the French and all this stuff, and to have them to be reduced to this level is it's just shocking, but I know that I don't like to just give stories of deficit, but also stories, and not to just say that we're all about resilience, but there's still a lot of strength in every people, and my husband's grandfather, as a Six Nations chief, he and other chiefs from Ontario paid their own way to go to the very first United Nations meeting in San Francisco after World War II. He was a young man. And they went, and my mother-in-law told me that they got there to the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco where it was being held, and they tried to get admittance, and they're like, who are you? We're the Iroquois Nation. Iroquois is another term for Haudenosaunee, and the Six Nations. And they were like, well, we don't have any Iroquois here on the list. And then she claims that they then went back outside, and they're like, what should we do? We spent all this money to get here from Ontario. And they decided to try again. So they went back in again. But this time they were admitted, but they were actually admitted as Iraqis. Yeah, seriously. And so this the most powerful nation, Indian nation, and so, and to this day, I in 2017, I got a grant to go to the United Nations because they were having the 10-year anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and I went and reviewed a lot of tribal leaders, and I was talking to one of them. He was an Adawa leader, and he was telling me that when he was, for like 15 years, when he was an elected, leader of his tribe, he was the chairman, and he would not come to the UN because he could not come as a representative of his government. He could only come under the sort of sponsorship of an NGO, and he only wanted to attend as an actual leader of his nation. And of course, the United States and Canada, they absolutely will not allow Indigenous nations to attend under their own nationality, sovereignty, and you see this also with my husband's people, the Iroquois Confederacy. They issue their own passports as an expression of their sovereignty, but when they try to compete every year in the worldwide lacrosse, playoffs or whatever, they have a hard time because all the members of the Iroquois nationals team all travel on Iroquois passports, and they have a really hard time because the U.S. and Canada will try to prevent those nations from accepting their passports. And lacrosse is a game that is an Iroquois game. It's the creator's game, and so it's the sport comes from the Iroquois Confederacy.
Yet another example of an attempt to erase an entire people. We are way behind schedule, so let's take a quick break here. On the other side of the break, we have a lot more to discuss. Hopefully, we can squeeze it into just a few minutes, but stick with us on the other side of the break. Go over to counterpunch.org, get yourself a subscription to Counterpunch Plus. That is how you support our work and, of course, all of the great people that we like to support as well. So stick with us on the other side of the break. We'll be right back. And we are back chatting with Jacqueline Keeler. Again, you should definitely get yourself a copy of the book. Oh dear, I dropped my notes. Here we go. I got them again. Definitely get yourself a copy of the book, Standoff, Standing Rock, The Bundy Movement, and the American Story of Sacred Lands. Definitely don't ever want to get authors' titles wrong, so I had to get my notes out for that one. And, of course, J.F. Keeler on Twitter. Okay, Jacqueline, I want to ask you a little bit about representation. We talked about it briefly in sort of the negative sense, representation in the sense of sort of a superficial kind of representation of a people. But now we are addressing something I think a little bit deeper, cultural representation of Native people making its way into the mainstream. Of course, for those of us who watch television and films, Reservation Dogs has hit a lot of headlines recently as a TV series. I think it's on Netflix, but that centers Indigenous people and I believe is produced by Indigenous people and directed by Indigenous people. But there are others, of course. There's films coming out, directors from Native tribes that are working in, I don't know if we could say Hollywood, but certainly breaking into the mainstream. So here's my question, setting all of that up. Is this representation? Is this tokenism? Or are we beginning to see something more akin to a sense of agency in representing themselves for Native people? Are Native people beginning to be able to do that?
Yeah, I don't know. I often feel like it does sometimes become reductive tokenism, honestly, and I think it's sort of it's interesting because Canada has so much more money for the arts. So often we are represented by First Nations people, even though there's more Native people here in the U.S. than there are in Canada. And so you'll never see a Navajo person anywhere, even though there's 500,000 Navajos in this country. And we're mostly full bloods. Most 90% of Navajos are full bloods. You'll never see them anywhere representing Native people. You'll see a Cree person from far north Canada instead. And it's the same thing with reservation dogs. Like most of the cast is from Canada, and so and people were like, well, the border doesn't matter, but it does matter because we have a specific political relationship both to the land and to our occupiers. And it has a whole legal situation with Indian federal law. It's real, and just like First Nations people in Canada have with the Canadian government, and before that the British Crown. And it's just different, anymore than I go up there and represent myself as First Nations in Canada and speak for everyone there. They would tell me to get lost if I did that. And so, but I mean, there's specificity to Native issues, and also having even one person speak for all Native perspectives, Oklahoma is kind of a unique place, and even between the tribes, there's a lot of differences. The Navajo Nation and the Cherokee Nation are about the same size, numerically, but they're very different. I think the average blood quantum in the Cherokee Nation is very low, and those are historical reasons for that. But it's not to say that one is right and one is wrong, but they are also different. So I think it's really, so it does, when I'm saying it does tend towards tokenism, but it's lovely to have a series featuring Native people. We have not had that. And I remember I ran a youth program for Native students in Oakland, California. And I remember I showed them, they've had TV series featuring entire Native casts, First Nations casts in Canada since the 90s, right? Since the early mid 90s. And, taking some of those out and showing them to my students in Oakland, California. And when I first started running this mentorship program, the students told me, they're all high school students, they told me that they were a minority amongst minorities in the Oakland school district. Like, they would often be the only Native student, and so and just the further marginalization, even in a city that was brown, right? And I showed them these TV series that were being filmed in Canada, and they were just shocked. They just had never seen themselves or anything close to represented the kind of representation in the media that that First Nations people have. We don't have here in the States, and we're about almost 30 years behind. In Canada, they have the Aboriginal People's Television Network. It's a network with hundreds of Native people full-time employed doing the news, TV, everything. We don't have anything like that here in the States. Yet we are a much larger population. And so we are marginalized and in these endeavors, and it's not enough to do tokenism. I think, and this is where it's a structural problem. And I have a structural fix. I talk a lot about my idea of a federal Indigenous government. I think that we actually have to have our own separate government and nation that works kind of in partnership with the colonial government, right? I got this idea actually. I was taught, my husband's paternal grandmother was Finnish American, and she was telling us how when she grew up in Waukegan, Illinois, even though she didn't grow up in Finland and she spoke Finnish at home, her father and his generation felt they needed to be able to read and write in Finnish, so she had to go to Finnish school after regular school. And she said the reason why it was so important to his generation, she came of age around World War I, was that in the 19th century, the Finns had to, they declared their independence from Sweden. Sweden was colonizing Finland for like 150 years. But when they wrote their Declaration of Independence, they had to write in Swedish because they weren't fluent in Finnish anymore. Because in the major cities, Finnish was sort of outlawed, right? And to get ahead, you had to learn Swedish. And so for him, his generation was very important that they learn their language, because the act of their political autonomy allowed them to reclaim their language. And it made me think about how when you are colonized, even if you're talking about Sweden colonizing Finland, and she had a saying in Finnish, which was that a Swede is a Swede, even if you boil them in oil. They had the same thing for the Russians. A Russian is Russian. So, if you're colonized by other people, even if you're the Finns are like the most deep pigmented people on Earth. They're like the whitest people on the planet. Even if you are the most deep pigmented person on the planet, everything about you is up for grabs. Your language, your land, your wealth, your children, everything is up for grabs, right? It's all takeable, right? And so it made me realize, and in Ireland as well, they have not been able to reclaim Gaelic. Their occupation by England was much longer than the 150 years that Finland endured with Sweden, and of course, with the potato famine, millions died. And so their lands, their lands and their lives were forfeit under colonization. So it made me realize that political autonomy is really important. Good fences make good neighbors. So I think for us to really reclaim a lot of this stuff, we are going to have to be a separate nation. and that would entail and this is a direct I think a lot of, and I go into this in some depth in the book about the issue of the doctrine of discovery. And the origin of the title that the U.S. claims to our lands comes from this doctrine of discovery, which was first articulated by one of the first Chief Justices of the United States, John Marshall. And he did three really crucial rulings in the 1820s and 1830s called the Marshall Trilogy, which are the basis of Indian federal law in this country, which apply to all citizens of federally recognized tribes. And his ruling was that he had a case where he had two men, and basically these two men, both non-native, had title to the same plot of land, right? And this was like in the Northwest Territories, right after the Revolutionary War opened them up to occupation, and so one of the men had gotten title from the tribe. The other man had gotten title. McIntosh had gotten title from the state, right? And he had to decide which title was actually valid. And he then called upon Vatican law because he's the Chief Justice of a brand new country, not a lot of case law to draw upon. So he was sort of drawing from all over the world. And so looking at Vatican law, there were a couple of papal bulls, one I think in 1492 and one in 1550, in which the popes articulated, two different popes, had articulated this sort of idea, which is that that only Christian discovering European countries had title. The minute they landed on our shores, they would land like at the mouth of a river, and where it opened to the ocean. They would claim the entire watershed. Right? They plant their flag, I don't know, put their, on a tree stick, and they read out an announcement. And at that moment, all of the land title, the fee simple title, would then revert to their monarch in Europe. And that indigenous people do not have title. This is actual law in the United States, active law. But all we possess is the title of animals, of use and occupancy. That's all we have. And so this was cited as recently as 2005 in a case, and it was actually Ruth Bader Ginsburg who wrote the decision and cited this law in the city of Sherrill, New York versus the Oneida Nation of New York. And the city of Sherrill had kind of created this bogus sort of rental agreement with the tribe back in the 1890s, and like a 99-year agreement. We'll pay you $1 and do this little ceremony, and we get to have the land, we get to rent the land. Well, they kind of didn't think the tribe would still be around in 99 years, and it was in the 1990s. And suddenly they thought that the title to their entire city was clouded, right? So they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against the tribe because tribes cannot possess title under the doctrine of discovery because we only have the title that animals possess, not title, but use, the right to the use of the land and occupancy. And so this denies our humanity at a fundamental level, and it's the basis of all title in the country, right? Paired with military occupation, right? So it's and some treaties that do give up land, but yeah, it's a really ugly history, and I think most Americans don't understand that this is the basis, and that fundamentally Native nations' actual humanity are denied. We might disagree with Pakistan, but we don't deny that they can have title to their land, But for Native Americans, we do. Native nations, we do. And this is because the Native nations claim is such, it so undermines that of the colonial state. And that's why our political existence is the most dangerous aspect about us, right? Is our political reality. And so the more politically real we are, the more dangerous we are.
I would love to ask about a dozen follow-ups to that really important information, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to run through a couple last questions here. Speaking of as you were mentioning in the example of Finnish or Ireland, this question of the loss of language, which is really part of a broader issue of sort of the loss of knowledge that would normally be passed down from one generation to the next, that is then lost, is essentially lost forever. This, of course, really I think comes to the fore when we're thinking about right now, when we're thinking about COVID. So, can you talk a little bit about the impact of COVID on Native people? I know that there have been many stories that have been written in the last 2 years about the devastating impacts, especially early on. Where does Can you talk a little bit about the impact, how this impacts cultural knowledge and collective memory, and all of these aspects that are so critical to preserving a semblance of sort of cultural sovereignty?
Yeah. So through the pandemic, the first year or so of the pandemic, I did a podcast, I think almost 3 times a week sometimes, where it was about the COVID response in Indian country. And so we dealt with a lot of issues. On YouTube, they have a video of the episode we did about, which is really interesting, um, in South Dakota on the Cheyenne River Sea Reservation, which is very close to Standing Rock. It's actually adjacent to Standing Rock. The tribe was doing COVID checkpoints before people could enter the reservation, right? And South Dakota did not take the pandemic very seriously. And one of the things we noticed during the pandemic was that the tribes in these red states were the only ones taking the pandemic seriously to protect, their culture bearers, to protect their elders and their population, which were so vulnerable because of a lot of contingent medical contingencies and stuff people had, and also just sometimes a lack of. I mean, on the Navajo Nation, where my family, my mother's family, are from, you have like 30% of the people don't have running water. Yeah, it's true. And my grandparents only got running water in the 21st century. You know, and so keeping up with the whole hand cleaning, washing stuff was really difficult. But the Navajo Nation and the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe and many tribes, they really held the quarantine. They really were. I mean, we're such a poor people, but they really took it seriously, and people acted on the best they acted for the benefit of all the people, and it was really impressive. I mean, it was actually quite moving to see the level of mutual aid happening on the reservations, the way that everyone came together for each other. And we covered a lot of that. I did a number of episodes on mutual aid, which is really a callback to our traditional way of doing things. And because we didn't have, I mean, the Navajo Nation, we didn't have autocratic governments. We didn't even really have government. We were pretty, I think, I feature one of my friends, Kleba Nolly. He's a Navajo anarchist, right? Our anarchist in Flagstaff from Pinon on the Navajo Nation. And he feels that anarchy, not the sort of European style anarchy, but there's a Navajo form of anarchy that is actually sort of our original way of doing things. And that really came to the fore again, the sort of mutual aid, doing things for each other. Really, it was very impressive. I featured a lot of folks who were working on that, including Ethel Branch, the former Attorney General of the Navajo Nation. She led an amazing mutual aid effort that became really successful. The Navajo Hopi Elders Relief, and her husband is Hopi, so they helped all the elders out there and people. And but with what happened at Cheyenne River, the chairman, they institute checkpoints, and governor the governor of South Dakota, she's a huge Trump supporter, far right Republican, and she really she tried to force the tribe to take their checkpoints down, and there was a huge standoff over that. And so we covered that. We had the chairman of the tribe on. We had Lakota, a friend of mine. She's Lakota and Navajo, like me, and she is a state legislator there. Red Dawn Foster, and all these. We had all these amazing guests talking to the issue, and so you can see that on YouTube. But yeah. I think it was. I think that for us, for the pandemic, there is a lot of tragedy. People lost a lot of relatives. I mean, we held the line, and we defined ourselves as a people, each nation, by that action, and we do it often in total defiance of the red states that we live in, right? That our nations are surrounded by, and so it was. I think it's still ongoing. It's just terrible to see the Navajo Nation going through another wave with the Omicron virus, and after they've held the line so strong and for so long now. But I think that I think for the generation that experienced that, I think it's going to define them in a way, because they've got a chance to express their who they are and how they are different and how this reflects on their own respective cultural traditions as a people. And so I think it was, in that sense, it was incredibly empowering. And I don't want that. I mean, often I think in white media they tend to give very deficit focused reporting, and it's important to report on those issues, but the fuller picture they sometimes miss because they don't understand what it is to be Native, right? And often a lot of people who they quote and stuff are people who are not even Native; they're pretendians or something. They live on a sort of trauma diet and get money that way, and so they don't present our issues in a more comprehensive way or an empowering way, giving us agency. Right? We have agency, and it's very important that young Native people understand how our people have expressed agency over the years, because that gives them a clue that they could do it, rather than simply telling them that Native people rolled over and died. That, what does that tell young people? And I just know, as a young person, I'm not a young person now, but when I was a young Native person, the stories in my family that I heard that showed me how my family resisted they were like little snippets of things that I just ate up, and I kept them close to my heart, and they gave me strength. And that's the sort of oral history that you don't read in books, but you learn from your own family. And so in this case, young people on the reservations got to see that in real life, and they got to express that. And a lot of young Navajos, they stayed home with their family, and rather than going to school, and there's a lot of energy given to planting traditional crops again. My mom's hometown in Cameron, her cousin May Franklin and other folks in Cameron, they brought back the community farm. You can go now and see they put up hoop, greenhouses. I mean, it's just so much has happened. I mean, I think that's a big, to me, I don't know, that's my part of the story. Obviously, there's been a lot of coverage of the negative things, and I recognize that, but I don't know. So.
To that point, and I hate to harp on another negative thing, but I think it's a critical issue that does have to be discussed. That the struggle that Native people have been waging is not just one against pipelines; it's one against extractivism broadly. And one of those issues is mining. One of the key ones, Oak Flat. That was the Trump administration wanted to move in there as quickly as possible, mine it, strip mine it, do all of that. But there's more to it than that, because it's not just Trump and Republicans. It's also Democrats, and it's pretty much everybody in the ruling class. But even more than that, there is also this looming question of a kind of environmentally friendly eco-green extractivism, whether it's pulling lithium out of the ground or various other forms of sort of green tinted kind of development. So I just wanted to give you a couple of minutes to speak about this issue, and especially the forms of resistance that Native people have been using to kind of push back against not just pipelines, but mining and extractivism broadly.
Yeah, it's yeah, when you're talking about Oak Flat, you're talking about copper mining, and there's a huge shortage of copper in this country. And that actually was not started by the Trump administration, but by Senator McCain and I think Senator Kyle. I mean, these are Republican senators that were from Arizona, and in his later years, McCain did a lot of really sort of shifty things against Native people in the state. That, and also trying to take the water. That was another thing that and he got chased out of the Navajo Nation for that. There's video on, you can see, of young Navajo activists, chasing him out of out of Window Rock, our capital. And then of course with lithium, that of course is necessary, for all of these sorts of technology, and solar panels and things like that. It's just quite there's going to be this extractive cost to Indian country that I'm actually I just signed a contract to do a book contract with Torrey House Press to work on a book about uranium mining in Indian country, and it's titled "Letters to Oppenheimer from the Fourth World," and I have a personal connection to that. I grew up. My father was an engineer, and he worked at Hanford, the nuclear reservation. So I grew up in Richland, Washington, and then my Navajo grandfather, was a uranium miner. And there are, around Cameron, where my mom grew up, there are over 200 abandoned uranium mines. And that sort of hangs over the Navajo Nation, right? The Navajo Nation is the size of Ireland. It has the population of Iceland. It's larger than 22 member states in the UN. About 170,000 speak the language fluently. It's got the parameters of a country. We don't even know it exists. I mean, it's like as if Iceland existed in the middle of the United States, and no one knew it was there, right? And but there are over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation, probably more, but that's the normal number that's decided. And for a long time, most of them were not had never been. There was no remediation done, and that's been a process, a very slow process. And yet, in the midst of all this, and of course, the issue of Yucca Mountain, and that is sort of a national storage area for uranium waste in this country. And of course, that's been fought by the Dan sisters and the Shoshone tribe. And I should say my cousin Nolan married into that family, the Dan family. So I have a personal connection to that family. And but they us Indians were all related somehow, And but I think, and then of course you see in Biden's 30 by 30 plan, this reliance on nuclear power to basically meet the reduction in carbon, and goals that we have right now, and so bringing back nuclear power. And we had I wrote a piece that was in High Country News and republished in Mother Jones, and was featured on Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, which was about when Trump reduced the Bears Ears National Monument. He reduced it by 85%. I looked into sort of what was some of the sort of things behind it, and I noticed that the state of Utah, the legislature, had submitted a 40-page comment during the comment period, and basically saying that their main point was that the national monument would damage Utah's uranium industry. And on either side of the Bears Ears National Monument, one side near White Mesa, which is a Ute Mountain Ute community, there is I think the only uranium mill in the country, and it's very badly managed. And then the other side is the uranium mine that they bring the ore to, and so it's so that was sort of, and I looked into it, and that company Energy Fuels played a huge role in reducing the monument. So I wrote an article about it, and I think I titled it, and they actually kept this title, with something like Trump says, let them eat yellow cake, or something like that. And the CEO of Energy Fuels, he put a letter on their website denouncing me stuff. But then the New York Times did further reporting. I think I published that in December of 2017, and then the New York Times did more reporting in January and February of 2018. They did a bunch of FOIA requests, and they found that it was accurate, that the Energy Fuels played a huge role in reducing the size of the monument, and the uranium was a driving issue behind it. And ironically, recently, with bipartisan support, Energy Fuels got $75 million from Congress in a bill led by Senator Martin Heinrich, from Democrat from New Mexico. And he's always out there against fracking and Chaco Canyon and stuff. He co-sponsored this bill, and this was brought to my attention by Native leaders who were upset that no money has been allocated for the co-management of Bears Ears by tribes and the federal government. And so that still has not arrived yet. Yet Energy Fuels, the company responsible for the temporary reduction of the monument has been restored under Biden. They have received $75 million. And I'm very concerned about that. And so my book will really take a look at many different areas in Indian country that have been basically sacrifice zones to the uranium industry, and like Hanford, like my mom's hometown of Cameron, and other areas like around the Black Hills, and San Onofre on the coast there in California, and also Prairie Island in Minnesota. There's a tiny Dakota reservation there. It's small. It's like barely a mile wide, and in the middle of it is a nuclear power plant. And so I'm going to look at all of those different things. So.
Well, I guess it's incumbent upon me as a member of the CounterPunch crew to point out that our managing editor, Joshua Frank, is finishing up his book about Hanford. So that should be out from Haymarket, I think, in the coming months. So a lot to discuss about that. And I think also just a message to any of the leftists and socialists and others who want to get on their high horse about nuclear power and the importance of the nuclear power to mitigate climate change. I think we should really consider all of these other impacts, as you were just pointing out, because it's not just about energy and climate change. It's also about many, many, many human beings and ecosystems and a whole lot more. I have like a dozen more questions that I would love to ask you, but I've kept you probably 30 minutes longer than I said I was going to. So I think we have to leave it there. Jacqueline Keeler has been with me today. Again, the books, so critical that you have to get yourselves a copy. Of course, Standing Rock, the Bundy Movement, and the American Story of Sacred Lands. That is a must read. Get it for Christmas, get it for your friends, your family, and anybody else who needs to have that information. Follow Jacqueline on Twitter. That's at JF Keeler. Jackie, thanks so much for chatting with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Listeners, viewers, thank you again for your continued support. If you're listening to the free podcast, go get yourself that CounterPunch Plus subscription. It will be a lifesaver. Jackie, thank you again. Listeners, we will chat again next week.